June 1967, Nui Dot Base, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. U.S. Army Military Intelligence Colonel Robert McKenzie had barely stepped off the ramp of the Huey helicopter when he was hit by a wave of unbearable stench. The air in the Australian camp was thick with a dense mixture of rotting fish, fermented nuoc mom sauce, and damp tropical earth. 23 years of impeccable service in the United States Army had not prepared the officer for such a physiological blow. McKenzie had arrived with a specific and classified mission to expose what Washington believed to be a massive falsification. The Pentagon categorically refused to believe the results being demonstrated by this tiny Australian unit. The figures in the official reports looked like brazen lies, typos, or the result of broken headquarters equipment. The kill ratio stood at 50-1 in favor of the Australians. By comparison, elite American units in the exact same region struggled to achieve a ratio of 7-1, which was considered an outstanding success. Staff officers in Saigon openly laughed at their allies' reports, claiming the Australians were either taking credit for others' work or had invented a time machine and were fighting against primitive tribes. However, the laughter in the high offices ceased abruptly when independent observers confirmed every digit of these incredible statistics. Colonel McKenzie was sent to find out the truth, however uncomfortable it might be for American pride. But the officer had no idea that this assignment would upend his entire understanding of modern warfare. What he would see in the next 48 hours would force him to question the competence of his own generals. The first shock overtook the American auditor just 60 minutes after arriving at the base. The colonel demanded an immediate meeting with the squadron commander. Expecting to see a trim officer in an immaculate uniform with maps and tactical schemes on his desk. Instead, he was casually pointed toward a group of people he initially mistook for local peasants or prisoners. They were squatting in the deep shade, their skin caked in a thick layer of mud, their hair hopelessly matted. Their clothing was a cross between rags and faded camouflage, completely violating every conceivable regulation. No rank insignia, no military bearing, only the heavy gazes of men who had long forgotten civilization. McKenzie barely suppressed a grimace of disgust, for the same nauseating smell emanated from these fighters as from the entire camp. It seemed unthinkable that these ragamuffins could be the very special forces elite about whom legends were told. Major John Essex, commander of the 2nd Squadron of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, rose to meet the high-ranking guest. He was only 34 years old, but deep wrinkles and sun-scorched skin made him look like a 50-year-old man. War aged these people with frightening speed. Essex didn't even think to apologize for his appearance or explain the cause of the terrible smell, which McKenzie had almost ceased to notice by then. Instead of a greeting, the major asked a question that felt like a slap in the face and stuck with the colonel for the rest of his life. He asked directly if the guest had flown in to learn how the Australians fought, or if he intended to teach them how to fight American style. This phrase contained the entire essence of the brewing conflict between the two Allied armies. The Americans conducted combat operations according to the textbooks of World War II and Korea, relying on massive firepower, airstrikes, and infinite resources. The Australians, however, did something completely different, frightening in its efficiency. They dissolved into the jungle for 10, 12, sometimes 14 days at a time. They did not seek large battles. They went out on the hunt, like predators. And the enemy only learned of their presence the moment their life ended. But the nauseating smell of rotten fish and mud was only the beginning of a series of shocking discoveries awaiting the colonel. The American colonel stood in a stupor, refusing to believe his eyes. These dirty men sitting before him were officially listed as the elite of the Allied forces. In his understanding, a military unit required iron discipline, polished boots, and clear subordination. But here, it seemed, absolute chaos reigned. The fighters lounging in the shade resembled local farmers or captured partisans more than professional soldiers. Their skin was covered in a thick crust of ingrained dirt, their hair matted into messy clumps, and their gear was an unthinkable mix of rags and crudely altered uniforms. This was a flagrant insult to all the regulations the United States Army held sacred. McKenzie expected to see officers with tactical maps and impeccable bearing, but instead found a group of savages who seemed to have merged with the primeval landscape. The commander of this strange formation, Major John Essex, stood to meet the guest, and his appearance only heightened the American's shock. The officer was only 34, but the brutal conditions of the jungle had carved his face with deep lines, turning him into an old man. War aged these men at an incredible rate, wringing every drop of life out of them. Essex made no apologies for the deplorable appearance of his subordinates and didn't even attempt to explain the heavy stench. Instead of a greeting, the Australian commander met the Pentagon representative with a challenge bordering on insubordination. He coldly inquired whether the colonel had arrived to learn the secrets of their efficiency or intended to teach them to fight by American standards. This insolent question instantly exposed the colossal chasm separating the two military cultures. The American military machine operated on templates from World War II and the Korean campaign, relying on overwhelming technical superiority. It was a war of motors, a war of endless resources and industrial might. The U.S. strategy was built on massive artillery strikes, carpet bombing, and loud, quote, 10 operations against large enemy forces. American generals believed the jungle could be conquered with fire and steel, scorching square kilometers with napalm and burying anything that moved under lead. The Australians, on the other hand, espoused a diametrically opposite philosophy that seemed like madness to the staff officers in Saigon. They did not try to conquer nature, they became part of it. Their teams dissolved into the, quote, 12 for 10, 12, sometimes 14 days straight. They operated without air support, without the roar of artillery, and often without radio contact, relying entirely on their instincts. This was not a war of soldiers marching in formation, but a war of hunters tracking prey. The Australians did not seek pitched battles. They preferred to strike precise blows from nowhere. The enemy often realized their presence only the instant their earthly path came to an abrupt end. Mackenzie listened to these explanations with a mix of skepticism and professional curiosity. It was hard to accept that a handful of men in rags could be more effective than a Marine battalion with helicopter support. But the numbers in the reports were stubborn things, and the colonel realized that behind this external squalor lay some frightening system. However, he did not yet know how deeply this system penetrated the very physiology of the fighters. The visual shock of meeting the quote, 14 was merely a prelude to the real discovery. The colonel was about to learn blood-curdling details of exactly how these men turned themselves invisible, and these methods went against all hygienic and human norms of the Western world. Mackenzie spent the next 2 days in a state of deep professional shock, studying internal documentation and interviewing fighters who resembled ghosts more than regular army soldiers. What he learned contradicted absolutely every principle that had been drilled into his head for years at the prestigious West Point Academy. It turned out that the Australians deliberately became part of the jungle in the most literal, nauseating, and physiological sense of the word. This was not simply negligence or a lack of discipline, but a carefully developed science of survival, forged in the blood of the first months of the Vietnam campaign. 3 days before going out on combat patrol, every soldier in the unit completely stopped using soap, toothpaste, deodorant, and any other hygiene products of Western manufacture. This was a strict taboo, the violation of which was punished by immediate removal from the operation. But simply giving up cleanliness was not enough to deceive the enemy. The soldiers rubbed their entire bodies with the acrid juice of certain tropical plants and liberally smeared their skin with fish oil mixed with local mud and humus. After 72 hours of this barbaric preparation, their natural scent became absolutely indistinguishable from the smell of Vietnamese peasants or rotting swamps. This seemingly savage measure was dictated by harsh necessity and the enemy's phenomenal senses. The Viet Cong possessed a sense of smell trained by years of guerrilla warfare, bordering on the supernatural. They could smell an American patrol at a distance of 200 meters with the wind. The sweet aroma of American Marlboro cigarettes, the smell of strong army coffee, the sharp notes of insect repellent, and even the scent of mundane ivory soap gave soldiers away long before they could be heard or seen. The Australians called this approach the Doctrine of Scent, and it became the first fundamental brick in the wall of their tactical superiority. However, smell was only the beginning of the transformation of a man into an invisible predator capable of striking and vanishing. The second critical element was silence. Absolute, inhuman, frightening silence, elevated to the rank of religion. Colonel Mackenzie personally witnessed a patrol preparing for departure and refused to believe his own eyes as he watched them manipulate their gear. The Australians spent 2 full hours solely on eliminating any, even theoretical, sources of sound in their equipment. It resembled preparation for surgery, where any trifle could cost the life of the entire group. With maniacal thoroughness, the fighters wrapped all metal parts of their weapons with cloth or electrical tape to eliminate any glint or clatter. They ruthlessly cut all buttons off their uniforms and replaced them with silent fabric ties, because a popped button could click against a rifle stock. Rounds and magazines were stacked in a special way so as not to rattle when running or making sudden movements. Every detail, every strap, every pocket was tested for its ability to produce sound, and if it failed the check, the piece of gear was ruthlessly removed or remade. But most surprising to the American observer was the footwear of the Australian Special Forces. They removed the standard steel plates from the soles of Army boots, which provided durability, but made a treacherous crunch on rocks. Each fighter resoled his own boots, replacing hard elements with soft rubber, often cut from old car tires. This allowed them not only to move silently, but to feel the terrain, literally sensing every twig underfoot. The American colonel watched these preparations skeptically, deeming them paranoia. In the Americans' understanding, this was a waste of precious time, since the jungle is already filled with noise. Birds cry, monkeys scream, tropical rain hammers on broad leaves. What difference does it make if a belt buckle clinks in this cacophony of sounds? Major Essex patiently explained to the guests that Vietnamese peasants and partisans hear the jungle from birth. They know every natural sound and instantly recognize an alien signal. The metallic click of a bolt or the creak of leather cannot be confused with anything living, and one such sound turns an ambush into a trap for those who set it. The results of this fanatical approach spoke for themselves and looked like a death sentence for American tactics. Throughout the entire year of 1967, Australian patrols were detected by the enemy prior to combat contact in only 7% of cases. This was a fantastic figure, signifying almost total invisibility. By comparison, American units in similar conditions were detected in 62% of sorties. This dry statistic explained the lion's share of the monstrous difference in casualties. The rule of the jungle was simple and brutal. Whoever sees or hears the enemy first usually wins the fight. But the Australians' main secret lay even deeper, and Mackenzie was to learn about it only on the second day of his visit. When the conversation in the command tent turned to methods of locating the enemy, Colonel Mackenzie noticed a strange change in the demeanor of the Australian officers. In their weary eyes, accustomed to the cruelty of the jungle, appeared something akin to religious awe, a feeling completely out of place for hardened professionals in the midst of a merciless war. Major Essex, lowering his voice, invited the American guest to walk to a separate tent at the very edge of the camp to personally see the main secret of Australian intelligence. A few minutes later, a man emerged from the canvas shelter at the sight of whom Mackenzie involuntarily took a step back, struck by his primeval aura. Before him stood Warren Tucker, 38 years old, a member of the ancient Walpiri people from Australia's Northern Territory. His ancestors had hunted in the scorching desert sands for 40,000 years. Longer than any known civilization on planet Earth had existed. Tucker was one of only 3 unique Aboriginal trackers working with the Australian SAS in Vietnam, and his skills seemed to the American to be something beyond reality. Essex proposed a field experiment that would once and for all dispel the Pentagon representative's skepticism. The terms of the bet were simple. Mackenzie had to walk 100 meters along an ordinary path, and Tucker, by the tracks left behind, had to determine everything he could about the person who passed. The colonel agreed with a slight smirk, expecting a standard Army performance. Direction of movement, approximate time of passage, perhaps approximate weight. He was sure this savage in a uniform could say nothing substantial, for the American officer knew how to walk quietly and carefully. However, what followed this walk forced the colonel to doubt the reality of what was happening and feel cold sweat on his back. Tucker studied the boot prints in the mud for exactly 23 minutes, sinking into a state resembling a deep trance. Then he dispassionately reported stunning details that could not have been known by any legal means. The tracker stated that the man weighed about 90 kilograms, his height was approximately 1 meter 82 centimeters, and his right leg was slightly shorter than his left, which he compensated for with a specific gait. Moreover, the subject was carrying a load on his back weighing about 15 kilograms shifted to the right and was a heavy smoker as nicotine addiction affected the placement of the foot. But this was only the beginning of a series of incredible discoveries that shattered the American officer's worldview. The most astounding revelation came at the end of the report. The tracker claimed that the person had last eaten about 4 hours ago and, most incredibly, was in a state of high nervousness and heightened vigilance. Mackenzie, speechless, demanded immediate explanations, for determining an emotional state from a patch of mud seemed like pure charlatanism. How the hell can one see fear or tension in a boot print? Tucker smiled calmly and pointed to microscopic signs, barely visible to the naked eye. When a person is tense, they look around more often, imperceptibly shifting their center of gravity, which leaves characteristic swirls of soil on the edges of the heels. The distance between steps becomes slightly uneven, breaking rhythm. The toe print presses into the ground deeper than usual, as the tense body instinctively prepares to dash or run, shifting weight forward. A hungry person places their foot differently, conserving energy, and a smoker has specific micromotor movements due to the influence of stimulants on the nervous system. Everything said turned out to be the frightening truth, down to the last comma. The colonel indeed had a congenital difference in leg length of exactly 8 millimeters, the result of an old childhood injury even his fellow soldiers didn't know about. He was indeed very nervous, knowing he was being evaluated by these strange people. The backpack was indeed shifted to the right due to a heavy metal water canteen, and lunch had been exactly 4 hours ago. The American Army used trackers, Vietnamese, Korean, local Montagnard tribes, but they did not have and could not have specialists like Tucker. His fantastic skills had been passed down from generation to generation over millennia of survival in the planet's harshest conditions. No military academy, not even the most elite, could reproduce or simulate 40,000 years of brutal evolutionary selection. Now Colonel Mackenzie was beginning to understand with horror why the Australian efficiency figures seemed impossible to the Pentagon. But understanding did not mean acceptance. The American military machine worked on different principles, and changing it was harder than winning the war. However, an even more humiliating test awaited the American ahead, one that would finally trample his self-confidence. The atmosphere of mutual distrust and hidden rivalry between the Allies wasn't limited to the stifling jungles and field camps. It seeped even into the elite establishments of Saigon. Another episode, which finally knocked the arrogance out of the American command and became a legend, occurred at the Officers' Club at the Rex Hotel, where the military elite gathered. A group of American Marines, celebrating a successful return from a mission, were loudly discussing the appearance of their Australian colleagues, not mincing words. In their eyes, these men in motley uniforms resembled a rabble of deserters more than regular Army soldiers, and the Americans openly doubted their ability to perform real combat tasks. Major John Essex, present at this conversation, calmly finished his beer and approached the table where the loudest critics sat. Instead of starting a drunken brawl that would inevitably lead to a court-martial, the Australian proposed a bet that took the breath away from those present. The stakes were high, a case of the best Scotch whiskey against a case of Australian beer, but the essence of the dispute concerned the honor of the uniform. Essex declared that his men, those very dirty tramps, could that very night penetrate the Long Binh base, the most heavily guarded American facility in all of South Vietnam. This statement caused an explosion of laughter among the American officers, for the Long Binh base was considered an impregnable fortress, the true Fort Knox of the Vietnam War. The base perimeter stretched for tens of kilometers and was surrounded by a triple ring of barbed wire barriers, stuffed with booby traps, lit by powerful searchlights, and controlled by hundreds of patrols with trained dogs. Penetrating it unnoticed was considered absolutely impossible even for a lone wolf, let alone a sabotage group. The Americans gladly accepted the bet, anticipating an easy victory and the public humiliation of the Australian upstart. But the laughter died down exactly 8 hours later when the sun rose over Saigon. The morning of the next day began with a colossal scandal that nearly cost the head of security at Long Binh Base his rank. An American brigadier general, stepping out of his headquarters with a cup of morning coffee, headed toward his service jeep parked in the very center of the safe zone. What he saw made him drop the cup from his hands. On the hood of the perfectly clean car was a bright sticker depicting a red kangaroo, the unofficial symbol of the Australian contingent, but that was only the harmless beginning. On the driver's seat of the general's jeep, neatly buckled in with the seatbelt, sat a case of warm Australian Victoria bitter beer. Attached to the crate was a note written in Major Essex's sweeping handwriting. Quote, 42. The base was raised on alert. Sirens wailed. Hundreds of police scoured every meter of territory, but no traces of penetration were ever found. Not a single flare had gone up. Not a single dog had barked. Not a single motion sensor had triggered. The Australian Special Forces had passed through the triple perimeter, minefields, and guard posts as if they were disembodied spirits. They didn't just penetrate the facility. They reached the very command center, left their gift, and exited the same way, unnoticed by anyone. It was a slap in the face to the entire American security system, a demonstration of the total superiority of skill over technology. The incident was immediately classified so as not to undermine troop morale, but rumors of the kangaroo on the hood spread across Vietnam faster than radio waves. Colonel Mackenzie, upon learning of this incident, realized that his skepticism was not just a mistake, but a dangerous delusion. If these men could pass unnoticed into the most guarded Allied base, then for them, borders truly did not exist. The bet was won, the whiskey delivered to the Australian camp, but the taste of victory was bitter for the American side. This audacious episode was the final argument that forced Mackenzie to stop evaluating the Australians by their appearance and start listening carefully to their every word. For ahead lay an immersion into the holy of holies of their tactics, an operation that turned waiting into the deadliest weapon of this war. Now the colonel was ready to learn exactly how the scheme the Australians called the spider web worked, and why it left the enemy no chance of salvation. The third day of Colonel Mackenzie's visit to the Australian Special Forces brought the main revelation he would take back to Saigon, one that would subsequently be buried in secret archives for the next 35 years. The Australian officers finally showed their hand and revealed the documentation on Operation quote 49 a tactical scheme developed specifically for the brutal conditions of the Vietnamese jungle. This concept was so simple in its idea, and yet so contradictory to the entire American military doctrine that it took the experienced intelligence officer several hours to fully grasp its frightening genius. American tactics of that war were based on the constant, aggressive movement of huge masses of men and equipment. Marine patrols scoured the territory, noisily sought out the enemy, engaged in firefights, called in air support, retreated to regroup, and attacked again. It was a war of motors, a war of colossal ammunition expenditure, and a war of dry statistics. The more shells fired, the more targets hit. The main problem was that the Viet Cong had studied this predictable tactic perfectly and learned to avoid it with virtuosic ease. The partisans simply vanished into holes at the approach of rumbling American columns, and then appeared where they were least expected. The Australians flipped this logic on its head, refusing the role of the hunter running after game. Instead of searching for the enemy throughout the forest, they forced the enemy to come to them into set nets. Operation .52 worked as follows. A small group of 4 or 6 fighters would covertly go out into the jungle and take up a position near a known enemy travel route, an animal trail, a river ford, or the outskirts of a village. Then happened what seemed unthinkable to any normal person. They froze. Not for an hour, not for 2, they turned into statues for days. A patrol could spend up to 72 hours straight in a state of absolute immobility, literally growing into the ground and becoming an invisible part of the landscape. This required not just endurance, but truly inhuman self-control. Fighters were forced to relieve themselves into special sealed containers and bags kept on their person so that not a drop, not a smell, would betray their presence in the area. They ate exclusively cold canned food, categorically never lighting a fire even to heat water. They slept in turns in short snatches, without moving, and even in sleep controlled their breathing so it would be silent. And then, after a day or 2 of this agonizing waiting, the enemy would appear, unsuspecting, relaxed, convinced of their own safety and the absence of strangers. And then the deadly .55 would snap shut instantly. The effectiveness statistics of such operations stunned even the most hardened skeptics at headquarters. The average kill ratio in ambushes of this type was 23-0. Not 23-1, but exactly 23-0. Over the entire period of active use of this tactic, the Australians lost only 2 men in _56_ ambushes, and both tragically lost their lives as a result of accidents unrelated to direct enemy action. However, dry numbers on paper are one thing, and the reality of the jungle is another. Mackenzie, shaken by what he read, requested official permission to be present on a real combat operation as an independent observer. Major Essex agreed to take the American with them, but warned him immediately. There would be no special treatment. The colonel would have to undergo the same grueling preparation as the Australian fighters. 3 full days without soap or shower. No coffee, cigarettes, or chewing gum. Total silence from the moment of leaving the camp. What happened in the next 43 hours, the American officer would later describe in a secret report as, quote, 58. The patrol dissolved into the pre-dawn gloom at exactly 4:30, leaving the safe perimeter of the base before the first rays of the sun. The group consisted of 5 Australian professionals and 1 American colonel who was about to survive the longest hours of his life. They moved at an incredibly slow speed, about 500 meters per hour, which was 10 times slower than the standard pace of American units on similar terrain. Every step was calculated with maniacal precision. Every branch moved with surgical care and smoothly returned to place so as not to disturb the natural pattern of the foliage. Mackenzie, accustomed to rapid forced marches and noisy air assaults, literally languished from tension, feeling this unnatural slowness twisting his nerves. By noon, the group had covered just over 3 kilometers and reached the designated point on the map, a small, densely vegetated rise just 50 meters from a trail. According to intelligence, this was a supply artery for a local Viet Cong cell used to transport rice and ammunition. The Australians silently spread out in a semicircle, took positions in the brush, and instantly turned invisible. From that moment, time stopped for the colonel, and the trial began, which he would later call his personal purgatory. The next 28 hours became true torture for the American officer, pushing beyond the limits of human patience. The air temperature in the shade reached 38 degrees Celsius with a monstrous humidity of 95%. The air was thick and sticky, like hot syrup, but the fighters had no right to take a single extra sip of water. Clouds of mosquitoes and ants attacked exposed skin continuously, causing unbearable itching. But the Special Forces soldiers dared not even raise a hand to swat the insects. Any sudden movement could betray the position, turning hunters into victims, and the Australians maintained absolute, deathly immobility. At one point, Mackenzie's nerves were subjected to a critical test of strength when a deadly creature rustled in the grass a few meters from his face. The colonel recognized with horror a bamboo viper, a venomous snake whose bite causes immediate internal bleeding and an agonizing death. The reptile slowly crawled past a frozen Australian sergeant, passing within an arm's reach of his boot. The soldier didn't even blink. His pulse, it seemed, did not quicken by a single beat. He allowed the mortal danger to pass just to avoid breaking camouflage. It was a demonstration of iron will that shocked the American more than any feat of combat. At the 29th hour of waiting, the situation changed abruptly. The first group of 7 Vietnamese passed along the trail. These were 3 men with light small arms and 4 porters with heavy loads on bamboo yokes. They moved carelessly, talking loudly. One even whistled a local tune, completely unaware that he was in the sights of 5 rifles. Mackenzie, following instinct, expected an immediate fire command. His finger was already on the trigger, but the Australian commander remained silent, and the group calmly disappeared around the bend in the trail. To the American, it seemed like criminal negligence, a missed chance, but he did not yet understand the depth of the tactical plan. The answer to his silent question came exactly 40 minutes later when a second group emerged from the green thicket. These were no longer simple porters, but 11 perfectly equipped fighters, the main combat security detail following the first party at a safe distance. It was a classic guerrilla tactic. Send a noisy bait ahead, let the enemy reveal themselves by attacking, and then strike the attackers in the flank with the main force. But the Australians knew this trick perfectly. They let the bait pass to snap the trap on the neck of the real predator. The Special Forces were waiting for this very second group, and now the enemy had no chance of escape. When the patrol commander finally raised his hand, signaling the attack, exactly 43 minutes had passed since the appearance of the first Vietnamese. 43 minutes of absolute, ringing immobility 30 meters from an enemy armed to the teeth. What followed could not be called a battle in the usual sense of the word. It was an execution. The squall of fire lasted only 11 seconds. 11 seconds during which 11 men fell into the tall grass without even managing to take their weapons off safety or understand where the disaster had come from. No screams, no return shots, no heroic firefight, only the dry crack of Australian automatic rifles and the dull sounds of falling bodies. When the smoke cleared, Mackenzie was struck not so much by the result as by the frightening math of this brief clash. The Australians had expended exactly 67 rounds on the entire operation. That was approximately 6 bullets per target. By comparison, American units in similar situations, panicking and spraying the jungle with lead at random, spent between 300 and 500 rounds per eliminated enemy. The ammunition savings were colossal, but even more impressive was the cold efficiency. The fight ended as suddenly as it began, but the Australians were in no hurry to celebrate victory or call for extraction. They continued to lie in their cover, scanning the jungle for a possible third echelon of the enemy. Only 20 minutes later did the commander give the signal to check the results. Mackenzie, still stunned by the brevity of the skirmish, descended to the trail. He saw the work of highest-class professionals who had left the enemy no chance of survival. However, a trial far more terrible than the heat or the sight of the defeated enemy awaited the American colonel ahead. He was about to encounter what the Vietnamese themselves called a nightmare. But before that, fate had prepared another surprise. A meeting with an enemy who considered themselves equal to the Australian ghosts. However, the Viet Cong command, bled dry by constant failures in the fight against an invisible enemy, did not intend to give up without a fight. The partisan generals understood perfectly well that ordinary peasants with rifles were powerless against the Australian ghosts and decided to play their last, most terrible card. An elite North Vietnamese special unit known as Viet Cong was urgently redeployed to the sector where Major Essex's group operated. These were not just soldiers, but true fanatics of diversionary warfare, whose name made even seasoned American Marines turn pale. The _72_ battalion specialized in deep penetration, silent elimination of sentries, and working in the most difficult water obstacle conditions. These men underwent training that could rival any Western survival school in brutality. 74 fighters could stay underwater for hours, breathing through hollow reeds, and could cross minefields with their eyes closed, relying on animal instinct. They went into battle practically naked, leaving only loincloths on their bodies, and thickly greased their skin with fat mixed with charcoal. This made them absolutely invisible in the dark and elusive to grab. A slippery body simply slid out of an opponent's hands. Their task was not to engage in a firefight, but to sneak up on a sleeping enemy and do their work quietly, using garrotes or knives. Colonel Mackenzie felt the atmosphere in the jungle change as the sun began to dip towards sunset. The air became thick with tension, and the Australians, usually calm, doubled their vigilance. Essex signaled that this night would be special. The group did not seek shelter deep in the thicket, but took up a position on a tiny islet of solid ground in the middle of a fetid swamp. This was the ideal place for a Viet Cong attack, exactly the kind of terrain considered their native element. The American realized with horror that the Australians were not hiding, but intentionally exposing themselves as bait for the most dangerous predators of this war. Night fell on the jungle like a heavy, impenetrable curtain. The darkness was so thick that Mackenzie couldn't see his own hand held up to his face. The sounds of daily life faded, giving way to the anxious whisper of the nocturnal forest. The colonel lay on the damp earth, gripping the handle of his pistol so hard his knuckles turned white. He knew that somewhere out there in the black sludge of the swamp, the best killers of North Vietnam were crawling toward them. American tactics in such cases prescribed setting trip flares around the perimeter and launching illumination rockets every 30 minutes, turning night into day. But the Australians did nothing of the sort. They simply dissolved into the darkness, becoming part of it. 3 hours of agonizing waiting passed, which felt like an eternity, and suddenly the absolute silence was broken by a barely perceptible splash, a sound like the movement of a large fish in water. Mackenzie held his breath. His heart pounded so loudly it seemed the beat could be heard a kilometer away. The Vietnamese saboteurs had begun their work. They crawled slowly, centimeter by centimeter, confident that the enemy was asleep or had lost vigilance. The _79 were used to dealing with Americans who relied on technology and slept on a schedule. They did not know that this night they had encountered those who surpassed them in the art of invisibility. The fight, if it could be called that, began without a single shot and without a single scream. Mackenzie heard only strange, dull thuds, stifled wheezes, and the rustle of bodies struggling in the mud. It was a battle of shadows against shadows, a primeval fight where firearms were useless chunks of metal. Someone fell next to the colonel, splashing him with swamp muck, but he dared not move, understanding that in this melee any sound could be fatal. The Australians worked with knives and bare hands, using the enemy's inertia against him. It ended as suddenly as it began. The jungle plunged back into silence, but now this silence was heavy, saturated with the smell of fresh tragedy. Dawn brought a scene that made the American officers' blood run cold. Around their position, within a radius of 10 meters, lay 6 bodies. They were the elite _82 fighters, muscular, covered in black grease, clutching sharpened knives in their hands. Not one of them had managed to land a strike. The Australians had outplayed them on their own field, in their own element, in total darkness. Essex's group had not lost a single man, and most astoundingly, they hadn't fired a single shot all night. It was total domination of one school of war over another. Mackenzie looked at these frozen figures and realized he had witnessed an event that would never make it into official reports. The Vietnamese elite, which struck terror into entire divisions, had been liquidated by a handful of men who simply knew how to wait better than their opponents. The special forces silently gathered their gear, checked the bodies, and moved on, as if this were just ordinary routine work. But for the Viet Cong, this night became a turning point. Rumors that the Australian _84_ could see in the dark and destroy the best fighters without a sound finally undermined partisan morale. However, the physical elimination of the enemy was only part of the strategy. What the Australians did after the battle instilled a far deeper, mystical horror in the enemy. Colonel Mackenzie had not yet recovered from the night's nightmare when he had to face the consequences of the psychological war these men were waging. The next episode of his journey would reveal the dark side of their effectiveness, methods that bordered on war crimes but worked flawlessly. It was here, among the bodies of the fallen elite, that the story began of why the Vietnamese started calling them Ma Rung, forest spirits from whom it is impossible to hide. But the most terrible and chilling shock awaited Colonel Mackenzie ahead when the smoke of the brief battle finally cleared over the jungle. After the last sounds of struggle died down, the Australians were in no hurry to leave the clash site or celebrate victory over the elite enemy. They remained in position for another 22 minutes to perform a procedure that made the American officer question their moral character. The Special Forces worked methodically, silently, and with frightening, almost robotic efficiency, as if performing routine work on an assembly line. The bodies of the neutralized enemies were thoroughly searched, all documents and maps seized for intelligence, and weapons checked and partially taken as trophies. And then happened what the colonel would later call in his secret report, a psychological operation bordering on a war crime. 2 Australian fighters began dragging the lifeless bodies and arranging them in a specific, strictly calculated order. This was not just cleaning up the area, but creating a macabre installation intended for the eyes of those who would come here later. The fallen enemies were laid face down, pressed tightly against the damp earth. Their arms were unnaturally stretched forward, pointing in the direction of the nearest village considered a partisan stronghold. From the side, it looked as if these men, in their final moments, were trying to crawl home, clinging to life with their last strength. But the final touch of this grim picture was the symbol the Australians left on each body. On the back of every neutralized fighter, right on the fabric of the uniform or on the skin, a large letter A was neatly carved or scratched, the tactical sign of the Australian Special Forces. Mackenzie realized with horror that this was not senseless cruelty for the sake of cruelty or a display of sadism. It was a cold, calculated message sent to the enemy in the language of primal fear. A message that would spread through the surrounding villages and partisan bases faster than any radio signal. It read, "We were here, we are invisible, we are invincible, and we will definitely return for the rest." This method of psychological pressure affected the enemy's psyche far more powerfully than carpet bombing or artillery barrages. The effect of such actions exceeded all command expectations. The Viet Cong, who did not fear American tanks and were used to constant airstrikes, began to feel a mystical, paralyzing terror before the Australians. They gave these invisible soldiers the nickname, quote, 95, quote, which translates from Vietnamese as, quote, 96, quote, or, quote, 97, quote, by 1968. The mere mention of this nickname caused panic among partisans in Phuoc Tuy province and a desire to leave the area immediately. But this was only the beginning of a massive psychological breakdown of an entire enemy army. Intelligence began intercepting reports from Viet Cong commanders containing direct orders to avoid any contact with Australian patrols. Entire partisan units, previously considered fanatically prolonged to the revolutionary cause, categorically refused to operate in areas where traces of quote 99 had been spotted. They believed one could fight men, but to fight spirits who come from nowhere and leave such signs behind was a sure path to a tragic end. The psychological war waged by the Australians turned out to be no less, and sometimes more, effective than the firepower of an entire American division. They turned the forest itself into a territory of fear for those who considered the jungle their home. The enemy no longer felt safe day or night, expecting a strike from the void. Colonel Mackenzie looked at the results of this work and understood that the price of such efficiency was measured not only in bullets but in something human that these men were leaving here forever. His report was supposed to be a sensation, but he did not yet know exactly how the system would react to the truth written in the blood and mud of this war. However, the true scale of the Australian Special Forces capabilities was revealed not in an act of destruction, but in a moment of dramatic rescue, when the vaulted American military machine signed its own powerlessness. In mid-September 1968, a tragedy played out in the sky over Phuoc Tuy province that nearly cost the life of one of the U.S. Air Force's best pilots. An F-4 Phantom fighter bomber returning from a combat mission took a direct hit from an anti-aircraft missile and turned into a blazing torch. The pilot, Lieutenant James Miller, managed to eject seconds before the multi-ton machine slammed into the ground, but his landing proved extremely unfortunate. The officer fell into thick undergrowth just 2 kilometers from a major Viet Cong base, suffering a severe leg fracture and multiple shrapnel wounds. The situation looked hopeless. He was deep in the enemy rear, immobilized, bleeding, and a ring of enemy search parties was closing around him. American command immediately launched a standard search and rescue operation, which in scale resembled a small invasion. Sky Raider attack aircraft were launched to suppress anti-aircraft guns. Along with heavy transport helicopters, soldiers called _103_. It was a display of brute force and technical superiority, but this very power played a fatal role. The roar of rotors and the howl of jet engines were heard by everyone within a 20-kilometer radius. The Viet Cong, understanding perfectly well whom the Americans had come for, set up a veritable fiery trap. The rescue helicopters were met with a dense wall of fire from heavy machine guns and RPGs. After one of the machines sustained serious damage and 2 crew members were wounded, the operation commander made the heavy decision to cease evacuation attempts. The risk of losing an entire team for one man became unacceptable. Lieutenant Miller was effectively written off, left to die in the jungle or await inevitable captivity, which was more terrible than any death. Gloom reigned at headquarters. Officers averted their eyes, realizing they had abandoned their comrade. It was at this moment that Major Essex, silently observing the radio traffic, proposed a solution that seemed like madness to the Americans. He stated he would send not an armada of helicopters for the pilot, but just 4 men. No air support, no artillery, no room for error. An American general tried to object, claiming it was suicide, but the Australians were already disappearing into the night. The group moved out to the crash site at nightfall, moving not like a military unit but like shadows gliding along a wall. They had to pass through an area literally swarming with enraged Vietnamese scouring every bush in search of the downed pilot. The quartet of Special Forces soldiers moved in absolute silence, using creek beds and animal trails even the locals didn't know existed. They passed within a meter of enemy patrols, heard the breathing of Vietnamese soldiers and smelled their cheap tobacco, but remained invisible. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Miller was preparing for the most terrible finale. The pain in his broken leg was driving him mad. He had lost a lot of blood and was on the verge of delirium. Gripping his service revolver with the last rounds in his hand, he swore to himself he wouldn't be taken alive. When the bushes next to him silently parted, the pilot raised his weapon, ready to take his last shot. But instead of shouts in Vietnamese or a burst of automatic fire, he felt a strong hand gently but with an iron grip cover his mouth, while another seized the revolver. He saw faces before him painted with black and green paint so that they resembled demon masks. These were not enemies, but they bore little resemblance to humans either. An Australian medic, without saying a word, professionally injected the wounded man with a massive dose of morphine to suppress the pain and, more importantly, prevent any moan during transport. What happened next was the pinnacle of infiltration mastery. 4 men lifted the 90-kilogram pilot and carried him on themselves through a jungle flooded with hundreds of enemies. The journey back took an endless 5 hours. It was not just transport, it was a deadly dance with death. The group had to freeze every few minutes, letting enemy patrols pass. Once they lay in the mud under the roots of a huge tree while a Vietnamese squad walked literally over their heads. The Australians controlled their every step, every breath, carrying the semi-conscious body of the American. They didn't break a single branch, didn't leave a single track, and most importantly, didn't fire a single shot. When the group emerged at the evacuation point at dawn, the American sentries on the base perimeter didn't believe their eyes at first. Out of the morning mist materialized 4 figures carrying a 5th. No shooting, no explosions, no heroic music. Just the quiet, exhausting work of professionals. The pilot was immediately handed over to medics and sent to a hospital in Saigon. The entire operation went so quietly that the Vietnamese command in the area never understood where their prisoner had vanished. They continued searching for the lieutenant's body for another 2 days, convinced he was somewhere in the forest. James Miller regained consciousness only 3 days later in a clean ward of a military hospital. When an intelligence officer came to debrief him, the pilot's first question was, quote, 112. The intelligence officer replied that it was a group of Australian Special Forces. The pilot, still under the impression of his experience, shook his head and whispered a phrase that later became legendary, quote, 113. This case became the most striking proof that the Australian tactic of, quote, 115 surpassed the American strategy of, quote, 116, not only in destruction efficiency, but also in saving lives. Where helicopters and attack aircraft failed, 4 men with painted faces did the impossible, simply because they knew how to be quieter than the night itself. But this triumph had a flip side no one thought about at the moment. A system capable of creating such perfect warriors would sooner or later demand a terrible price for its gifts. Colonel Mackenzie was about to learn exactly how this efficiency breaks not bones, but souls, and why those who survived the jungle often envied those who remained there forever. Colonel Robert Mackenzie returned to stifling Saigon with 23 pages of dense handwritten text, which at that moment weighed more than the entire gold reserve of the United States. In his worn briefcase lay not just a mission report, but a detailed instruction manual for saving the American Army from inevitable disgrace and catastrophic losses. The officer was absolutely convinced that his conclusions would have the effect of an exploding bomb and force the high command to immediately review the entire strategy of combat operations. He believed that common sense and obvious facts would break through the wall of military bureaucracy, for the lives of thousands of his compatriots were at stake. His report landed on the wide lacquered desk of General William Westmoreland, commander of all American forces in Vietnam, in July 1967. What happened next entered history textbooks as a textbook example of criminal institutional blindness and general arrogance. Westmoreland, a man commanding a 500,000-strong troop contingent, spent exactly 15 minutes of his precious time studying the document. He scanned the pages describing the, quote, 119 tactic, the work of the trackers, and the phenomenon of, quote, 120 without even trying to delve into the essence of what was written. The commander's reaction was immediate and withering. The general left only 3 careless pencil marks in the margins and returned the document with a categorical resolution: not applicable to conditions of large-scale operations. Archive. Contained in this short word, archive, was a sentence not so much for Australian tactics as for thousands of American boys who were yet to go into the jungle. Westmoreland was firmly convinced that war is won by big battalions, massive carpet bombing, and overwhelming firepower, not by small groups of saboteurs hiding in the mud. The Pentagon's logic was reinforced concrete and simultaneously deeply flawed. America had total technical superiority, unlimited aviation, the most powerful artillery in the world, and endless resources. Why should a great power copy the artisanal methods of a tiny army that numbered only a few hundred fighters in Vietnam? Generals considered it beneath their dignity to learn from those who looked like tramps and fought without the support of tank wedges. This decision was dictated not by military necessity but by banal pride, which did not allow admitting that someone could fight better than Americans. However, behind this bureaucratic stroke of the pen lay a monstrous tragedy, the scale of which would only become clear decades later. The decision to ignore the Allies' experience would cost the United States tens of thousands of lives lost in senseless attacks and loud operations the enemy knew about in advance. The American military machine was too cumbersome to pivot and too narcissistic to listen to advice. To admit Mackenzie was right would mean admitting the fallacy of the entire doctrine into which billions of dollars had been invested and on which the careers of dozens of generals were built. It was simpler to write off the unique Australian experience as special conditions and put the inconvenient report in the farthest drawer of a secret archive, where it would gather dust for the next 35 years. Mackenzie left the commander's office devastated, realizing his country had just missed perhaps the only chance to win this war with little bloodshed. But understanding came too late, and the millstones of the military machine were already grinding new fates, oblivious to warnings. However, even this coin had a flip side, which the colonel would learn about later. Those who applied these effective methods paid a price for them that could not be measured in money or medals. However, even the most brilliant military success has its dark, invisible side, and the bill the war presented to the victors turned out to be truly monstrous. Mackenzie's report was rejected, but even if it had been accepted, no one at that moment could have guessed what terrible price was paid for this superhuman efficiency of the Australian units. This price was not measured in losses on the battlefield, where the Australians were practically invulnerable. It was measured in the crippled souls of those who survived. Psychiatric reports from the military hospital, which were strictly classified and only saw the light of day in the 2000s, paint a picture that was hidden from the public for decades. By 1969, more than 40% of Australian SAS veterans who had passed through the hell of the Vietnamese jungles showed clear signs of severe mental disorder. But the nature of their internal trauma differed radically from the classic Vietnam syndrome that mowed down American draftees en masse. Americans suffered from chaos, from a sense of helplessness and the meaninglessness of what was happening, seeing comrades die and not understanding where the enemy was. Their trauma was the deep trauma of a victim thrown into a meat grinder of circumstances. Australian Special Forces soldiers suffered from the diametrically opposite, and this diagnosis frightened doctors far more. They never felt like victims. In the jungle, they were absolute, dominant predators. And it was this status, elevated to the absolute, that destroyed their human essence from within like corrosive acid. Many fighters described their state with a term psychiatrists would later classify as predator depersonalization. After months of continuous spiderweb operations, hours and days of motionless waiting in the mud, instant executions, and ritual work with bodies, a man ceased to feel like a man. One sergeant, having served 2 full tours and returned home outwardly intact, formulated it frighteningly accurately. He confessed to doctors that he had become something else, neither bad nor good, but simply a different biological species. He could lie in a swamp for days, coldly running through scenarios of eliminating people in his head, while feeling absolutely no emotions. An icy void formed inside him, like a snake before a strike, and this void displaced everything human: compassion, fear, joy, and pain. This psychological mechanism worked perfectly in war, turning soldiers into flawless machines, but it backfired catastrophically upon return to civilian life. People who had forgotten how to be human for the sake of victory returned to sunny Australia and discovered with horror that they were aliens in their own home. They didn't know how to talk to their wives, how to raise children, how to go to a regular job and pay bills. The silence of a peaceful city deafened them more than explosions, and the absence of danger caused unbearable anxiety. But the most terrible thing was hidden in dry statistics the government tried to hide under the stamp _quote_136_. The suicide rate among Australian SAS Vietnam veterans exceeded combat losses by a shocking ratio of 3 to 1. For every fighter killed by an enemy bullet in the jungle, there were 3 men who returned home as heroes but could not live with what they had turned into. They left quietly, without suicide notes, unable to bear the weight of the darkness they brought back with them. There were other dark secrets that were kept silent for decades even within families. The practice of handling enemy bodies, those same gruesome intimidation rituals Mackenzie learned about, left an indelible imprint on the psyches of the perpetrators. Individual cases recorded in closed investigations spoke of actions that, under any international interpretation, constituted war crimes. The Australian government denied the very existence of these documents for years, protecting the reputation of elite troops until persistent investigative journalists forced their partial declassification in 2012. Military historians and psychologists still argue fiercely. Could such phenomenal combat effectiveness have been achieved without this moral fall into the abyss? Or was this darkness an inevitable, mandatory price for the ability to survive and win where others died by the thousands? Every veteran took the answer to this question to the grave, leaving the living only legends of their invincibility. But even this dark chapter could not cross out the fact that at the decisive moment of history, it was these broken men who turned out to be right. But let us return to the central episode of this incredible story, which became not just a military curiosity, but a true symbol of the clash between 2 polar military cultures. In August 1968, American command was planning a massive offensive operation codenamed _quote_140_, one of the largest of the entire war. To secure the flanks, General Westmoreland's staff urgently needed precise intelligence on a vast square of jungle in Phuoc Tuy province. The Americans turned to their Australian allies with a formal and seemingly routine request: provide units to clear the sector as a reconnaissance vanguard. Staff officers in Saigon, used to thinking in categories of giant armies, implied that the Australians would allocate at least a full company for this task, between 100 and 120 men. This fully corresponded to American doctrine. A large unit moves on a broad front, engages in firefights, locates the enemy, and calls in air support. However, the response that came from the Australian headquarters stumped the American planners completely and made them question if the telegraph equipment was working. The Allies succinctly reported that they would send exactly 4 men for the task. The American colonel who received this message decided there had been a monstrous communication error or a ridiculous typo by the cryptographer. He immediately sent a request for confirmation, but the answer was categorical and unchanged, confirming allocation of 4 fighters. An exchange of urgent telegrams followed, which subsequently made it into all textbooks on inter-allied cooperation as a textbook example of a cultural chasm. The American side demanded in a sharp tone to clarify the numbers, insisting that a sector of 40 square kilometers required at least a reinforced battalion for adequate coverage. The Australians parried with icy calm, stating that the given sector required the work of 1 patrol and 4 professionals would be quite sufficient. When the Americans declared such a meager contribution unacceptable, the Allies issued an argument bordering on an insult. They stated directly that their 4 men would provide better reconnaissance than an entire American battalion. By their logic, a battalion with its noise would scare away everything living within a 20-kilometer radius, and the enemy would know about the offensive a week before it started, whereas the quartet would remain unnoticed. The correspondence, full of mutual irritation, lasted 3 days and reached the level of Army commanders. In the end, a forced compromise was reached. The Australians agreed to allocate 2 patrols of 4 men, a total of 8 fighters for a giant sector of jungle. At the very same time, in a neighboring sector of similar area, the Americans deployed a battalion numbering 500 bayonets. The results of the operation, tallied a week later, confirmed the Australian correctness so convincingly that it became the subject of a separate closed analytical report, which was read in the Pentagon with faces red from shame. 8 Australian Special Forces soldiers, over 7 days of covert surveillance, discovered 3 camouflaged enemy base camps, 2 large weapons caches, key supply routes, and anti-aircraft positions. They never once engaged in combat, as their task was exclusively reconnaissance. The ghosts of the jungle simply transmitted precise coordinates by radio, and American aviation turned the targets into dust. The American battalion operating in the neighboring sector lost 11 men wounded and 3 killed during the same period. Meanwhile, they discovered not a single significant enemy object and fell into hard ambushes twice. Their movement was heard and seen for kilometers, so the Viet Cong simply skirted them, striking dagger blows from the rear and dissolving into the greenery. After the operation concluded, the American battalion commander, stunned by such a difference in results, demanded a personal meeting with his Australian colleagues. This conversation, reconstructed by historians from participants' memoirs, revealed the fundamental difference in approaches. When the American asked how they managed it, the Australian captain replied simply, "They don't try to be everywhere at once. They choose key points and become invisible, controlling information, not territory. Territory is useless if you don't know what is happening on it." When the American asked about the safety of such a tiny group in a forest full of enemies, it was explained to him that safety is invisibility. 4 men can disappear, become part of the scenery, but 500 soldiers with equipment, never. This iron logic contradicted everything taught in prestigious American military academies, where the principle of concentration of force reigned. More people means more fire and more chances of victory. The Australians proved the opposite in practice. In guerrilla warfare, less often means more, but the giant American military machine could not rebuild itself overnight. Too much was invested in the existing doctrine, billions of dollars, political ambitions, contracts with defense contractors, and the very structure of the armed forces. To officially admit that 8 men are more effective than 500 would mean admitting that the entire war strategy was flawed from start to finish. It was simpler to write off the phenomenal Australian success as an accident or special luck and continue acting the old-fashioned way, flooding the jungle with napalm and the blood of their soldiers. However, history was inexorably approaching its finale, and time showed who truly understood the nature of this war. The war ended exactly as the skeptics predicted, leaving scars on the body of an entire generation. The United States lost 58,000 men in Vietnam, and those were only the ones who didn't return home alive. Australia paid a price of 521 lives, which seemed comparable when adjusted for population size, but when analyzing combat effectiveness, it was heaven and earth. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment eliminated or captured more than 5,000 enemy fighters during the campaign, losing fewer than 50 of their own professionals. No American unit of comparable size came even close to such fantastic figures in all the years of the conflict. And yet, these dry numbers changed nothing in the Pentagon's strategy, at least during the lifetimes of those who made the fatal decisions. Colonel Robert Mackenzie concluded his service in 1972 and never publicly commented on the fate of his scandalous report. He passed away in 1994 at the age of 73, taking his bitterness to the grave. However, in his personal papers, handed over by his family to the National Archive, a copy of that very document with General Westmoreland's dismissive pencil marks was preserved. In the margins of the yellowed paper, Mackenzie had made his own inscription, dated 1973, which reads like an epitaph for the entire American strategy. "They were right. We were blind." Major John Essex served 2 more tours in Vietnam and finished the war with the rank of lieutenant colonel, becoming a living legend among his own. He was one of the few Australian SAS veterans to escape severe psychological consequences, or at least outwardly he appeared unbroken. After retiring, the officer worked as a security consultant in the private sector and categorically refused to give interviews to journalists about his military past. "What we did, worked," was the only thing he told a reporter attempting to get a comment from him in 2005. But that doesn't mean it's something to be proud of. Warren Tucker, the genius tracker from the Walpiri people, returned to Australia in 1969 and never left the Northern Territory again. He turned down lucrative offers to work as a military instructor and spent the rest of his life in his native community, passing on traditional survival skills to the younger generation. He did not consider himself a hero and never wore his medals. "I did what my grandfather taught me," he explained to rare guests. "I hunted. Only the prey was different." True recognition of the effectiveness of Australian methods came a generation later, and it came by winding paths when ignoring the facts became impossible. In 1977, Colonel Charles Beckwith, a Vietnam veteran, was tasked with creating a fundamentally new Special Operations Unit for the U.S. Army. Beckwith, familiar with Australian methods, created the famous Delta Force on the very principles that American command had arrogantly rejected 10 years earlier. Small teams, long autonomous operations, an emphasis on invisibility rather than firepower, all this became the foundation of the new elite. The irony of history lies in the fact that methods rejected in Vietnam as inapplicable became the gold standard for American special operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. When Delta and Navy SEALs began hunting terrorist leadership in the 2000s, they used tactics almost identical to the Australian spiderweb. Prolonged covert surveillance, lightning-fast precision strikes, and powerful psychological pressure, all of this was invented in the jungles of Puoc Tui. But between Vietnam and Afghanistan, 30 years and several bloody wars had passed. Lessons that could have been learned for free back in 1967, Americans learned only in 2003. And the price of this tragic delay is measured not in years or money, it is measured in thousands of human lives. 50,000 Americans whose lives were cut short in Vietnam after Colonel Mackenzie's report landed on the general's desk became victims not only of enemy bullets, but of their own command. Of course, it would be a simplification to claim that implementing Australian methods would have guaranteed saving everyone. But historians agree on one thing: the stubborn ignoring of successful experience was a criminal mistake. Today, when modern American special forces go out on a mission in groups of 4 or 6, they repeat the path laid half a century ago. When they lie in cover for days, waiting for the moment to strike, when they cover themselves in mud to become part of the landscape, they don't even know to whom they owe this tactic. They act like the men the enemy called ghosts and spirits of the forest. Like the men the Allies didn't want to listen to because of their pride. Like the men whose 4 fighters were worth a whole battalion. And that was not a joke, but the harsh truth of war. The Viet Cong gave the Australians the nickname Ma Rung, forest spirits, and feared them more than fire. The Pentagon gave their reports the classification secret and put them in the farthest drawer, hoping to forget their humiliation. But history put everything in its place and delivered the final verdict. Just 4 men. "Are you joking?" the Americans asked in '68. No, generals. The Australians weren't joking. They simply knew what you had yet to learn for another 30 years, paying for every lesson at the most terrible exchange rate that exists in this world.